All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. My name is Trevon Mares, and I'm the Director of Policy and Community Outreach here at the LGBT Center in New York City. For this webinar, we wanted to have a discussion about what the electoral process is like, really to take a closer look at some of the barriers to voting and how we can overcome them and empower the Latinx and other marginalized communities in our civic engagement work. This conversation is particularly relevant given the recent elections and how we can think about how we continue to set the groundwork beyond Election Day, because ultimately what we're fighting for is bigger than a single election. Before we start today's webinar, I also wanted to go over some processes. So everyone has been muted so as not to distract the presenter and other participants while the webinar is taking place. And we're also recording the webinar. So to make sure that we are moving forward, there'll be a few pauses during the presentation where we take written questions. So if you think of a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to type it and share it with us. So we hope to take a few questions throughout the chat and then again at the end. For those of you that don't know, the webinar is part of our LGBTQ Power speaker series that we are offering really to engage partner organizations across the state. And the goal of these webinars is for LGBTQ and allied communities to hear about relevant advocacy opportunities and campaigns that are happening to get a broader sense of what it takes to mobilize our amazingly diverse community to advance LGBTQ affirming protection statewide. So we hosted a presentation back in May on the barriers to success and what it takes to move policy forward in New York. We hosted a webinar last month about unpacking gender and existing protections for transgender and gender nonconforming people. Today's webinar is about engaging Latinx communities in civic organizing. And in December, we will also be having another presentation with Vocal New York around how to center marginalized communities in our advocacy work. So registration for these webinars is forthcoming, and we'll make sure that you will have RSVP details once they are available. As the Center's advocacy work continues to grow, it's really important for us to make sure that we are reaching people where they are, and we are making sure that they're connected, informed, and engaged in our civic engagement work. So if everyone listening could grab their cell phone and quickly text the word RiseOut to the number 69866. By doing so, you'll join our mobile network and automatically start receiving alerts with information on webinars like this and other ways for you to take action on LGBTQ rights whenever there's an opportunity to make your voice heard. So if you're already signed up, feel free to share the code with friends or coworkers or family members. The more people who are involved in this work, the better. With all of that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Alejandro Sordo. Alejandro is the Director of Civic Engagement and Organizing at the Hispanic Federation and oversees many of the important campaigns and organizing work they do. So without further ado, here is Alejandro.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining the webinar. I'm super excited to be partnering up with the LGBTQ Center in promoting not only our work, but also in building relationships with more and more communities so that we're going to talk a bit about intersectionality, but also just how we can build power together. So I'm super excited to be here. And yeah, let's get started. So as Trevon mentioned, we're going to be talking about a bit about how we can empower the Latinx community, not only around civic engagement, but also around advocacy. So we're going to be breaking down a bit of the strategies and tactics that we use here at Hispanic Federation.
I did have it on video, but no one else did, so.
I'm sorry?
I think that was someone, but I will make sure that they are muted.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Don't worry. So just a little bit of background. As Trevon mentioned, I'm the Director of Civic Engagement and Organizing. I am an immigrant from El Salvador, and I came to this country 6 years ago due to, again, the violence that forces a lot of other migrants to flee their countries. So when I was 5, did I say, hey, I want to do civic engagement? No, but coming to this country as an immigrant and seeing how Latino communities and other communities of color were constantly disenfranchised and powerless, not only at the electoral level, but at just the people power level, that is what got me involved in civic engagement, because that's one of the areas in which we can build power and elect leaders that represent our values. So that's how I began getting involved. I started my work in Long Island. I've been doing civic engagement for 5 years now. I'm extremely passionate about it. And I have seen the way that it has transformed communities across New York State and other states that we have been working on, and how when Latino voices are uplifted and given the chance to participate and exercise their rights, we can see true change. So that's a little bit of who I am. I was a journalist in El Salvador. So again, I saw the issues firsthand. And that's one of the things that has fueled me to do community work throughout my life. And that's where I am right now. So that's a little bit about me. So Hispanic Federation, we're a Latino nonprofit membership organization. We were founded in 1990, and the purpose is to advance and strengthen the Latino community, not only in New York State, but we have been doing work in 5 states this year. And the objective is, of course, to empower and advance the Hispanic Latino community, primarily through service pillar like membership services, advocacy, and community programs. And among that, we're going to talk specifically about the area that I work in, which is civic engagement. So a little bit about how we do civic engagement, and our vision of civic engagement is not only to, as Trevon mentioned, to go election by election, but it's mainly to build a long-term infrastructure of civic participation within the Latino community, more so a culture of voting and participating in every one of the decisions that affect us. And to that end, we have a strong voter education component, voter registration, and voter mobilization, because for us, it's a cycle, right? So we offer immigration services because we want the Latino community specifically to be engaged, but also to become citizens. As we know, there are millions of Latinos who are legal permanent residents and that are eligible for citizenship, but sometimes they don't have either the means to apply for citizenship or the resources to pass the exam and know what to do. So that's one of the areas in which we are doing a lot of work, because that's where it starts, right? When we're talking about civic engagement, it starts with becoming citizens, then further on getting registered to vote, and then of course hitting the polls for every single election and knowing what's going on around you, your community at every single level. So we do a lot of volunteer training, civic education, community forums, town halls across the different states that we're doing work in, and we register voters. So one of the ways that we have been registering voters is actually at the citizenship ceremonies in the courthouses. As soon as they become citizens, right then and there, we explain to them that they now have the right to register, kind of like the right and responsibility to register and vote as citizens of this country. So that's one of the places where we go and provide civic education and then register them to vote and provide information about every single election that's coming up. And then again, more voter mobilization, because if we have a registered voter that doesn't vote, that doesn't do much. So we also want to emphasize the importance of knowing what elections are happening and how their vote can make a difference and matters in every single election, especially in local elections. And that's where we do our massive voter mobilization. So for this year, it was our biggest one yet. We mobilized over 1 million people across New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Georgia, and Florida. And we did it through different tactics. So The main one that we used was texting. So why? Because texting, everybody's on their phone nowadays. So it's a easy and fast tool in which we have been able to engage community and give them key information about what's going on, tell them that they are registered to vote, because one of the main reasons why the Latino community and other communities are not voting is simply because they don't have key information. So they might not know where their polling location is. They might not know the polling hours, where they have to go and vote, what elections are happening. So simple information that we can provide to them right then and there on their phones has proven super effective when it comes to mobilizing the community to go out and vote. So again, this year was massive. We had hundreds of volunteers and canvassers here in our offices. So the last few weeks have been pretty intense, but definitely worth it, because we saw an increase, right, in voters of color hitting the polls. And that was one of our goals for this year, is to reach as many people as possible, especially Latinos, in key areas. Again, we focused in areas like Georgia and Florida, where in Florida, for example, there has been a large influx of Puerto Rican community fleeing the island because of Hurricane Maria. And that has been a key area where we developed one of our strongest efforts, because they are newly arrived, and they are still learning how to navigate the political system here. So that's one of the areas where we actually register the largest amount of voters. If you see the picture on the screen, the bottom picture, that's in Florida, and that's our team over there. And we registered over 27,000 Latinos in Florida, and Central Florida to be specific. So that was our largest voter registration campaign, followed by New York. So that's a bit of the work that we did this year, and it can only go bigger from there, because as we know, 2020 is going to be huge as well. But we also focus a lot on local elections, because if we can get our communities to vote local, we know they're going to vote in the major elections. So that's one of the efforts that we are definitely trying to do. Of course, when we talk about civic engagement in states like New York, we have to talk about barriers. New York likes to see itself as a progressive, amazing state, and we do have amazing things. But when it comes to voting laws, we could definitely be better. New York has one of the most archaic voting laws in the country. We are not part of the states that have automatic voter registration, for example. 15 states now, New Jersey recently just added it. Plus DC have approved automatic voter registration. That's something that we don't have, and that would increase voter turnout significantly and voter registration significantly, because it has proven it would be kind of like an opt-out. So everyone would be automatically registered as soon as they turn 18 if they have contact with any government agency, and then they would have the option to opt out. So instead of kind of like the opt-in to be registered, it would be if someone specifically says, I don't want to be registered to vote, that they would be opted out. But that would definitely increase voter registration significantly through the state. And that's one of the reforms that we're definitely fighting for. The other thing is same-day voter registration. New York has very strict deadlines when it comes to voter registration and party affiliation. So we don't have same-day registration, meaning that someone, for example, a lot of the people that we were texting for election day, they were saying, like, I'm not sure if I'm registered, can I still register? And we would review it, and yeah, sure enough, they weren't registered, or they hadn't updated their information, and that's something that they couldn't fix right there then and there, because they had to have done it. But for example, this year they would have had to do it by October 12th, which was the deadline. So it's 28 days before election day that you have to update or register to vote, which again decreases voter turnout when it comes to the elections. So again, that's one of the other major barriers that we have here in the state of New York. Another is failure to modernize voting systems. we have encountered, haven't done this work for 5 years now, we have seen places in upstate or Long Island where they still have the machine where you pull the lever to do voter registration. So that's something, again, there's a failure to modernize the system that would make it more effective. Other states have the electronic machines, which have proven much more effective. But here in New York, there's still a lot of counties where the systems are completely outdated and make it harder for people to vote. The other thing, and a lot of people don't know this, it's the purging of the voting rolls. So when we're out registering people, we constantly ask them, have you voted in the last 4 years, 3 to 4 years? Have you voted in the last 2 elections, either local, state, federal? Why? Because we have seen cases where people have been taken off or marked inactive. We saw this a lot in 2016 for the primaries, where people did not show up in the voting rolls, for example, and they knew that they were registered. So one of the things, and it's sad because it depends from each one of the counties, because each board of elections in the counties can establish pretty much their own rules when it comes to this. So the law states that if someone hasn't voted in 2 federal elections, they are purged and marked inactive, meaning that if they go and try and vote, they will appear inactive and they won't be able to vote. So, but federal elections, some counties think of it as 2 presidential elections. Some counties think of it as 1 midterm, 1 presidential. So for us, it's very important to tell everyone, if you haven't voted in the last 4 years, please re-register, because you could be marked inactive and then not be able to vote at all if you go and try and vote for any election. So that's one of the things that we have encountered in a lot of counties in Long Island, for example, that people have been marked inactive and not been allowed to vote. And then, of course, good old disenfranchisement of communities of color. So we have a lot of voter restrictions here in New York. It's improving little by little, but the felony disenfranchisement. So if you are in prison, you're not allowed to vote. If you're on parole, now this year there was a pardon by Governor Cuomo that passed where you have to get a specific pardon from the state in order to be allowed to re-register to vote. But as of last year, this was not in place. So if you were in prison or on parole, which could be several years after you're out of prison, you were not allowed to register to vote. You're only allowed to register if you're on probation. With the parole, there's not a lot of information. So even if someone is on parole, they don't know what they have to do to re-register to vote. So it's a large education campaign that needs to happen in that sense. And also, they don't know about this pardon. And a lot of times they're told, and we have encountered this, especially in communities of color, when we talk about African American, Latino communities in different areas across the state. As we know, the criminal justice system affects predominantly communities of color. We have seen that they are constantly told that they're never going to be allowed to re-register to vote. And that is the case in several other states. But in New York, as long as you're done with parole, you're able to re-register. Or if you get a special pardon from the state while on parole, you're able to re-register. So that's, again, another part of the voter education work that we're doing. We're out on the streets registering voters. We tell them about this. And honestly, they're one of the happiest people when we tell them that even on parole, if we help them get the pardon, they're able to re-register. They're the people that I've found the happiest to actually re-register to vote, because it's a right that they thought it was completely stripped from them forever. But it's not, at least not in New York State. And as you know, in Florida, there was a ballot measure that just passed that would allow 1.4 million people to re-register in Florida. So that was a huge win for democracy. And we're super excited to be able to work on that in Florida as well. So, but again, it's something that you only have 2 states where you have 0 restrictions, and those are Maine and Vermont, where anyone, despite being in prison, on parole, or on probation, they're able to register to vote and vote. The other And this is something, again, that we saw a lot in 2016. It was the closed primary system. Again, very strict deadlines. If you want to be able to vote in a primary within a specific party, and it's only the two major parties, Democratic and Republican, you have to register with the party almost a year in advance in order to be able to vote in the primaries. So this only allows a very limited number of people to vote for primary elections. So that, again, that's another way of disenfranchisement, because we have that system in place here in New York. So, for example, if you want to vote in next year's primary elections, you would have to have registered with a specific party of your choice by October 12th of this year. So it's almost a year in advance in order to be able to vote in the primaries. The other is we don't have early voting. We saw this year that early voting allowed for thousands and thousands of people. We saw a surge in voting, especially during early voting. Why? Because it makes it easier, right, for people to vote. Because as we know, Latino or communities of color, they don't have a lot of flexibility at times with their schedule. So it's not like if you say, oh, you only have Tuesday from 9 a.m. to from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. What if they're not able to go that day? Early voting gives you options, and that benefits communities of color very specifically. And there are 37 states that have early voting, and New York, again, is not one of those. So that's another one of the reforms that we really want to fight for, to have all these measures that would make it so much easier not only to register, but also to exercise your right to vote. And then voting ID laws. New York does not have strict voting ID laws. We have, not legally, but we have seen cases specifically with Latinos where they have been asked for IDs at the polls. And that's why during our efforts, we work really closely with the ACLU and Latino Justice here in New York to make sure that this does not happen. Because we saw cases in Long Island and upstate where people were being asked for IDs when they were Latinos. So that's something that's a complete violation, and it's a form of disenfranchisement, because as we know, strict voter ID laws disproportionately affect people of color, youth, and seniors. So that's something that we're always on the lookout for, because it's one of the ways in which they tend to disenfranchise voters of color. So that's something that we always are working with organizations that provide legal services to make sure that this doesn't happen. And then good old gerrymandering. One would think that, because we hear cases of Virginia and Pennsylvania and other states, but New York, it's crazy. If you look at the map of the different districts, and I'm showing this district in Brooklyn, which is Senate District 20, which if you look at it, it basically looks like a vacuum or a shovel. I don't really know what you would look, but that's a great example of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a way in which you cut the districts in order to fit very specific voters that would benefit one party or the other. So we have seen this across the entire state in Long Island and other places. We have every possible shape you can imagine. You have snakes, horseshoe, anything. And all that definitely affects the democratic process, because you cluster voters into very specific districts and you take out voters that would make it more even when you're talking about diversity of voters in these areas. So again, you have representatives that are being elected for 20, 30 years. And a lot of that has to do with gerrymandering, because they have within their district very specific voters that are going to allow for that. So that's another thing, another one of the reforms that we want to fight for, so that there's an independent commission in the drawing of the districts, just like California has, because as of now, the way that it works in New York State, it's that the party that's in power post the census is the one that redraws the districts. So for example, this happened in 2011, the current drawing of the districts, and the next one will be in 2021. That's why the census is so important to us as well, because it will allow for the counting of Latino communities and other communities. And then that's that's the data that they're going to take into account when they redraw the districts in 2021. And who draws them as of now will be the party that's in power by 2021, instead of being an independent commission that would look simply at the data and draw districts evenly. That's what we're working with on here in New York, because it's something that is completely affecting the democratic process. So I'm gonna pause for now for a few questions, because I know I've talked a lot. So I really want to be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Alejandra. We don't have questions yet. Just a reminder for people who are joining, if you think of a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, type it and share it with us. I had a question though,
Sure.
which was just about sort of like the gap in voter education, because as someone who moved to New York State 2 years ago, which is somewhat recently, I was also unaware of specific restrictions in New York, like early voting. So what strategies, or how do you combat just people who don't know that this is how it works in New York and it works differently elsewhere? And are there current campaigns that Hispanic Federation is a part of that is working to sort of like change some of the voting laws here?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, there's a large gap when it comes to voter education, specifically in Spanish. So that's one of the gaps that we're trying to fill with any and every type of event that we want to host. We do a lot of coalition building as well when it comes to this, because we want the different communities to be informed. So we have worked with Minquan Center, for example, that serves the Asian community across Queens and New York. Because there are so many similarities and the same gaps that we see in the Latino community, we see it in a lot of other communities. So a lot of coalition building. We are part of campaigns or support campaigns such as the voting reforms that has been going on for 3 to 4 years, along with Common Cause and other agencies here in New York that are constantly fighting for voter reforms. I believe it was called Democracy. Forget the name right now. Let New York Vote. Sorry, that's what it was. Let New York Vote. That's a campaign that we have supported as well. But for us, education, we do it at a very local level. So whenever we have a chance to host any type of event and talk about this, that's what we do. We partner up with community centers and other organizations within communities of color, such as Make the Road and other organizations that are across the state that serve the Latino community, so that we can also provide any type of education when it comes to voting and voting reforms, and get the community to support. So one of the things was also that we do a lot of outreach when it comes to reforms. Actually, for the November 6th elections, we did a texting campaign specifically for the ballot measures that were on the back of the ballot. So we were informing Latino voters about what those were about, because they had a lot to do when it comes to civic engagement. So the one we were supporting was ballot measure number 2, which would allow for an independent commission at the city level for civic engagement, so that the community has more participation in the budgeting process. So that's one of the ways also in which we provide education, because we reach out to people and tell them, hey, do you know about this ballot measure? Do you know what it is? Do you want more information about it? So we try to educate at every turn that we have a chance to, when we're door knocking, when we're texting, when we're hosting phone banks on public education, when we do advocacy work with other organizations. So for us, it's very important to educate the community on all the issues, to get also buy-in and support on these campaigns.
Thanks. There's another question that just came in about sort of just elaborating on the connection between gerrymandering and the census.
Sure. So the last census was in 2010. So the census allows for the counting of the people of the state. And when you don't have enough participation, let's say within the Latino community, then so after every census, that's when the state legislature sits in and says, hey, let's redraw the state districts, which are the state Senate and state assembly districts in New York State. And they do it based on census data. So let's say when you talk about gerrymandering, if they see clusters, let's say if you're talking about a specific party, they see clusters of a certain community, they're able to cut through them or kind of like exclude them. And that's the problem of gerrymandering, because you're able to see, right, where, let's say there's a large African-American population, and if you're a politician that maybe doesn't want the African-American vote, you would say, oh, let me draw it in a way that I can exclude them from my districts. And that's why you have the completely gerrymandered districts that we have. But the census, when you have it's two things. The census is very important because we want Latino communities and every community of color to participate, because it also determines resources for the community. So if you have an accurate count of the people within a community, that's how the state splits the resources. So either for schools or for parks or for streets or repairs or anything, they're given based on the number of population that a specific district has. So that's why we want the communities of color to be completely counted when it comes to distribution, because that would allow equal distribution of districts. And the other is that you would have a better count when it comes to drawing the districts. But for now, sadly, since it's the party in power that would draw it, it's still very much, it's going to continue to be gerrymandered, because you're going to be able to see what voters you want within your district and what voters you don't want. And that's why the thing that we want to fight for is an independent commission that would draw the districts in a way that you have equal representation. Let's say you draw a district in a way that you have equal within all races, so that you have when you elect a leader, you have representation for everyone within the district, because as of now, that's not happening. And that's the connection with the census. It shows you, let's say, where, like, the number of communities, because each district is drawn based on population numbers. Let's say a district is supposed to have a certain population number and it's drawn, but with the census, you can see what race or what age or what gender the population is, etc., and draw it in a way. If it were an independent commission, it would be a more equal way, because a more representative way, because you could choose, okay, I want equal number of men, of each community of color or gender or age, etc., and you can make districts that are more equal. But right now, since we don't have an independent commission, my fear is that it's going to continue to be gerrymandered.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alejandra. No other questions.
Cool. So how do we break down? So we spoke about all the barriers, right, that we have, but again, our constant fight is to break down these barriers and make it easier, right, and a more representative process and an easier process for every community to get their voice heard when it comes to elections. So how do we do it? And one of the ways that we have seen, and we get this question a lot, and so I'm very used to it, is like, why do y'all do nonpartisan work? Like, why don't you choose partisan work instead of that? So I get that a lot, but when you come from communities of color, for example, my family is in Long Island, I grew up in Long Island, when you have never had a representative from either party knock at your door, why would I care about a party? So that's kind of like the way that I see it. And we don't want uninformed voters. We don't want voters that just blindly vote, right? Especially not within our community. So for us, C3 or nonpartisan work allows us for a lot more voter education, because then you can talk about the issues that the communities care about, rather than saying vote for this or that party. We go deeper than that, and we can help them make informed decisions when it comes to voting. So when you talk about the issues, you talk about policies or bills or laws that could pass that would benefit the community, rather than just talking about a specific candidate or a specific election. So nonpartisan work allows for a long-term civic engagement culture that would allow the voter to constantly say, hey, let me check all the candidates, let me see what they represent, let me see what platform they have, what they're supporting, and see if it matches my values and what I care about. So that's the beauty of nonpartisan work. And I believe that when it comes to specifically the Latino community, it's the only way to go, because we have seen a larger increase when you have that conversation with someone, because you have a lot of apathy, or you have that idea that the parties don't like the parties. If a party has never knocked on your door, what that creates a sense of like my vote doesn't matter, right, to them. So rather than that, nonpartisan work allows us for the voter to connect voting to the issues that affect them on an everyday basis. And that's why we go very local. And I was explaining this at the event that we had at the LGBTQ Center, is that when talking to voters, you constantly get pushback, and they say like, why my vote doesn't matter? Why should I vote? Like, they don't do anything for me. And that's where we dig deeper and we go into what they want to see improve in their community, or what's affecting them. It could be education. It could be as simple as, I want better textbooks for my kids in their school. I've spoken to like taxi drivers, and for them it's like they need to fix the streets because the streets are messing up my car. So it could be a million things, and by going local, you start connecting voting to what's affecting them on a daily basis. Like if they hate the subway, the delays, or if they hate that their streets are dirty, or when it snows, their streets aren't cleaned up. That's where you connect it to local government, for example, like things that are affecting you directly. If you create that connection at a very local level, then you can create a connection. It goes further later on into general, right, into bigger policy and legislation. So for us, nonpartisan work and local work is very important, because that's the way that we have found most effective to engage with the communities that have been historically disenfranchised and neglected. It's by them giving them kind of like back that power to decide at a very local level. And we saw that in different areas of New York, for example, when we're doing local work, and you have seen that how elections are determined by like a couple of votes. For example, in Long Island, in certain districts here in New York City, literally a few dozen votes or a few hundred votes have made a difference. And that's where you can actually see kind of like a short-term impact, because that's what sometimes maybe the community needs to see, how at the very local level they have an impact, and then that turn it into bigger picture, right? If you were able to make your voice heard at a local level, let's keep going and do it at a state and federal level. The other is language access. So again, when we talk about lack of education or lack of knowledge around civic engagement, the fact that there aren't resources in Spanish is huge. It's a huge issue. And I saw it with my family, for example. That's why civic engagement is so close to me. Because I'm coming from different countries, the political system is completely night and day sometimes. So for us to understand how it works, it takes time, and it takes a lot of knowledge building. So for me, it's like, it took me a long time to honestly understand the electoral college and the primary system and all this and that. And I have the privilege of being able to speak English. So for me, it was easier to learn about this. But then I see my parents who have a language barrier. And for me, it's like, there are no resources for them in Spanish, or there's no way where they can go as new immigrants and say, hey, I want to learn about this. Like when you become a citizen, you don't get a class on civics, for example. So there's a huge lack of resources in different languages. And that's something that we found when connecting with a lot of other communities, like the Asian community, for example. Also, again, there's a lack of knowledge and resources for them in their language, which make it so much harder for them to get engaged in the process. Because if you don't have information in your language, how are you going to learn about the how to participate in the electoral process? So that's something that we try to do. When we're texting millions of people, we offer it in different languages, Spanish, of course, but we have been including other languages as well. And we ask them what language they prefer. And we have people in different languages. And that's why we partner up with other organizations, such as like Minquan and Chaya and other organizations across the state that serve different segments of communities of color. Because for us, civic engagement is built also when your communities have access to the information in an easy and accessible way. The other thing is providing voter protections. As I mentioned, we partner up constantly with the ACLU, with NYCLU, with Latino Justice and other agencies across the different states that we're working in. Why? Because we know that voter disenfranchisement affects our communities at a higher rate. And that's why we want to offer protections. In Florida, we gave out flyers with information of a number that everyone could call if they had issues at the polls, or if they were being disenfranchised in any way when they went to try and vote. So that's something that we constantly want to try to offer our community, because again, when there's lack of knowledge, they might think, oh, it's normal for me to be asked for IDs in New York when it's actually not. So things like that we really want them to have resources to be able to exercise their right in an easy way. And then working with ethnic media, again, that's part of language access. So a lot of the work that we do is with Univision and Telemundo. We had large campaigns this year across the different states where we provided information and a hotline where people could call and get information in their language. So for us, that's a key way of building education and also providing resources to the community. And again, so linking it now to advocacy and the issues that affect our community, as I mentioned, doing C3 work, doing issue-based work allows us to link civic engagement constantly to the issues that are affecting the community. So that's why at Hispanic Federation, we work on so many different issues, such as education, health, immigration. Oh, sorry, I have education twice. Economic empowerment and the environment, and a lot of other issues. But right now at the forefront mainly is immigration because of the attacks that we have seen on our community from post-2016. We have seen constant attacks on immigrants and communities of color. So, and of course the LGBTQ community as well. So the different segments of the population that are being affected by harmful policies allow us also to connect civic engagement to that. Because for us, it's like, if you're angry, if you don't like the policies that are coming out of Washington, if you want to protect communities, if you want us to pass bills that are going to protect our communities, then that's where voting matters, right? Voting and organizing need to go hand in hand, because those are the two powers that as the people we have. So if you are not able to vote, you're still able to organize and make your voice heard, right? So we have people power and we have voting power. Those two powers hand in hand are unstoppable when it comes to creating and building power within communities of color. And of course, also connecting to the different segments of communities and building coalitions and doing work together. So here are a few examples of the advocacy work. I only put 2 examples, but the advocacy work that we're doing, a lot of it has to do at the state level. We're working on the farm worker bill, which would allow farm workers across the state to have equal rights, equal working rights, such as paid vacation or two-day weekend and other reforms that would make it a more equal job for farm workers, because right now they're being exploited at every level. So that's one of the bills that part of economic empowerment we're working on. And then, of course, immigration and family separation has been a huge issue. And at the moment, it's the public charge rule that just came out. So that's something that we're working a lot on. And that's something that we saw when contacting voters, because we saw that anger for things that are happening. And we just tell them, make your voice heard, right? If anything that you care about and that you want to change, that's where your vote matters the most. So we connect every one of our efforts to civic engagement and vice versa, right? So when we're talking about civic engagement, we talk about the issues, and when we're talking about the issues, we talk about civic engagement, because again, they go hand in hand. And these are just a few other examples of the organizing work that we do as well, because it goes hand in hand. We have our civic engagement efforts, but we also have our advocacy and organizing efforts. So a few of the pictures, the DREAM Act, of course, is a huge issue that we're working on. The first picture it was to a rally to keep ICE out of courts, because Latinos and immigrants were being detained within the courts. And that's something that we were also pushing back against. The family separation policies that were horrifying throughout this year. So that's something that we were very vocal about. The third picture, again, is the family separation. It was a rally that we did with the New Immigrant Community Empowerment. We put shoes to represent the father. This was for Father's Day this year. So all the fathers that were separated from their children due to deportation. And again, the Dream Act. So for us, advocacy, organizing, and civic engagement go hand in hand. And again, intersectionality, and that's why we work with so many different communities and groups, because together, right? And I put the quote of Audre Lorde here, which is, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. So we actually are part of a coalition that is a communities of color in general platform, where we want to create a state platform linked to legislative advocacy that's going to fight for the different segments of the community that are constantly being affected. So that includes, of course, communities of color, but it also includes women, LGBTQ community members, and youth as part of the platform, because we are seeing that these groups are, like our groups are being most affected by harmful legislation and policies. So that's why we do a lot of coalition work and advocacy work that is going to benefit the different segments of the communities, because again, like when one community is affected or one community is uplifted, we all are. So it's all about connecting that and making sure that we are able to build that power. I mean, power is in numbers, and power is when we have all the issues together, we push together for a platform that's going to benefit all of us. So that's part of the work that we do as well, and it's a matter of understanding. Working with Minquan, for example, it was funny because we found so many similarities when it comes to civic engagement work that they do and that we do, and the same barriers or the same issues that they encounter within the Asian community were so similar to ours. And that's a way that we found that, like, we can build strategies together, because then we can help both our communities be uplifted and get engaged civically. So it's just a matter of connecting those dots and building power together. And then another pause for questions.
Thank you, Alejandra. There are no other questions in the chat, but I think that that's a great and uplifting note to end on, because a lot of times, you know, with coalition work, we recognize that our communities have so much more in common than differences,
Yep.
and that our communities are often shared and they don't sort of work against each other, which is a common and untrue narrative
Exactly.
that sometimes we see. But just to be mindful of time, I want to thank you all again for joining today's webinar, and I want to thank Alejandra for an insightful overview. I will be following up with everyone who joined the webinar and others who've expressed interest in receiving a recording of the presentation, just so there's more time to unpack it. So that will be made available as well. The last question that I have for you, Alejandra, is if anyone listening just wants to sort of like plug in and get involved in some of the work that Hispanic Federation is doing, how do you recommend they go about doing that?
So we work on different areas, but you can just email me directly if you're interested in getting in civic engagement or any of the other areas. We're doing a lot of different campaigns, especially now with the new state representation that we're seeing. I know next year is going to be a hard push for a lot of different issues, not only for the Latino community, but for different communities across the state. So you can connect with me. I can write my email, or I can, if you can send it to everyone, Trevon, if you connect with them.
Yep.
And then you can connect with me directly, and whatever issue you want to work on, or if you want to get involved in civic engagement, I'd be happy to add you to our list.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to be able to talk about something that I feel very passionate about. So I'm super excited, and any questions that you might have, maybe after the presentation, you're like, I have that question I forgot to ask, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always open to answering any questions or connecting with folks.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.